Nancy, Professor Nancy Law, who's the architect of the annual conference CSCL in Hong Kong, and I think that we should perhaps create this opportunity where the learning scientists on the one hand and the leading policy leaders in major international organizations should have an opportunity to have a dialogue, which after this 1.5 days interaction proves to be necessary and rather rare until now, and we hope it won't be rare anymore. And that brings a lot of unusual interactions and perspectives to assist us in the policy forum. And we think the policy forum is not just an academic forum for ourselves, but it's a global policy forum. It's meant for the larger audience around the world. But we also think that we should use this opportunity while many of the CSCL participants are already here, and also to use this as a microcosm with so many international members for us to test our thinking. I wouldn't labor more because you will see in the following. Let me first ask our members to stand up when I introduce them, and then after that they walk up and take a seat. There's no particular order of the seats on the stage. First of all, we have Dr. David Eastons from OECD, from the CERI, as you know, Center for Education, Research and Innovations. We have a professor on the stage, please. Dr. Diana Lorilat, who's with the London Knowledge Lab, which is also associated with the Institute of Education London. Dr. Guangzhou Kim, who is the director of UNESCO Bangkok. Dr. Marcela Cajado from Chile, but she's also hosting a network of educators and researchers in Latin America. Professor Marcia Lin, who is professor of cognition in UC Berkeley. Dr. Molly Lee, who's the one who's in charge of higher education at UNESCO Bangkok, and Professor Naomi Miyake, who's a professor at the Tokyo University Learning Science. Dr. Su Xiang Lim, who's the director of Science of Learning Center program in NSF, National Science Foundation USA. Dr. Yves Punier, who's from the European Commission. He's also in charge of the ICT for Learning, Innovation and Creativity. Last but not least, we still have I'm sorry. Sorry. This is how the mind works. Professor Keith Sawyer, professor at Washington University at St. Louis, and people will know him as the compiler of the Cambridge Handbook for Learning Sciences. Last but not least is Dr. Mancita Malope, who is now the Director of Division for Basic to Higher Education and Learning at UNESCO Paris. We have a special guest, Ken Chan. Oh yes, I forgot. I forgot our own member. Professor Numero Rao, of course. You know her for her extensive experience in early childhood education around the world. And then we have a special guest, Mr. Kenneth Chan. You know him from the newspaper. And he will be he will be making the concluding remarks. Now what we are trying to do is we ask Dr. Mansita Marope to introduce to you why we are here and what is the value added because of this meeting. And then we'll ask Professor Keith Sawyer to say something about the learning science and how it could make a difference in policies. And then Professor Nancy Law will give you a fundamental understanding of what will come out of this meeting. Thank you very much. Dr. Marope, could you come here? Yes.
Thank you very much, Kai Ming. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I'll just say in brief that we came together here as a group of interested people who share a concern for learning, which is not just our concern, our collective concern, but also a global concern. And we want as an agenda to contribute to the collective effort to relocate learning at the center of education enterprises and to reinforce learning as the core business of education enterprises. And you may wonder why, isn't this obvious? And we would say yes and no. The first one is, why do we want to reinforce the centrality of learning to education enterprises? Is that we live in the 21st century, which is characterized by fast pace of change, unpredictable change, and constant change. And this impels the need for constant self-renewal and lifelong learning as a critical base to build capacity for agility to adapt, because the education of the 21st century, its most effective part is building that capacity to continuously adapt, to face 21st century challenges, but also to harvest opportunities which often are fairly unpredictable. So lifelong learning becomes an imperative, even more so than before. The second reason is that we want to believe that our knowledge base on learning and what facilitates learning, what constitutes effective learning, has consistently improved. It's moving fast, like the 21st century change. And while knowledge is improving, we don't believe that it's being optimally harvested to impact education policies and practice. So we are trying to bridge the gap between knowledge generation, knowledge application, and reinforce the knowledge brokerage role of people like yourselves and ourselves in this room. So it's about harvesting some of those opportunities of the 21st century, which is knowledge explosion. The third and most critical challenge is that we live in a globalizing world which is becoming wealthier, but it's also becoming progressively unequal. We have the knowledge divide, we have the digital divide, we have the income disparities, social, you can go on and on and on. And we know the tensions and the spasms this creates in terms of political instability, social fractures, and everything else that begins to choke development. So at the same time, we know that education is one of the most effective distributor of life chances, and education has the most effective redistributive effects, and it redistributes all forms of capital, be it intellectual capital, financial capital, political capital. Education redistributes all these forms of capital. And therefore, it means if we have inequity of learning opportunities, it means we are highly likely to reproduce or even exacerbate inequalities of all these forms of capital. So one of the compelling reasons is for us to improve learning but to improve learning equitably. So this is one of the factors. We may ask why? Because a denial of a learning opportunity is an infringement on a human right. Learning, first and foremost, is a human right. Secondly, it's a denial to develop. At an individual level, micro level of an individual, meso level of families, communities, and households, but the macro levels of countries and the global level. In the 21st century, where economies, the best levels of economic growth and social development are knowledge and technology. Countries need knowledgeable and technology-savvy human resources to become globally competitive, but also to become sustainable and to sustain growth. But with the equity imperative I mentioned, we are also concerned about not just growth, but shared growth, not just development, but inclusive development. And we believe if we can reinforce learning equitably, put it at the center of education enterprises, we can contribute to all these. Thank you very much.
Keith?
Yes, thank you. In the history of education systems, I believe that policymakers have thought of pedagogy as an afterthought, taken for granted. The policymakers are the people who decide what should be taught, and pedagogy researchers decide how to teach it. But I believe that this division assumes a sort of model of teaching and learning that Seymour Papert called instructionism, also known as transmission and acquisition. And learning scientists are discovering that this division between policy and pedagogy, or the science of teaching and learning, doesn't work for what we're loosely calling 21st century skills. Things like creativity and collaboration and communication. So if we maintain this divide between policy and learning sciences, or policy and pedagogy, then we will not be able to design schools for the 21st century. We will not be able to design the schools that we need for today. So I believe that's why we're here, to make an argument that this wall has to be bridged, or the wall has to come down, whatever metaphor you choose, that for us to design the schools that we need for the challenges we face, we have to bring together learning and policy in a much more intimate way than we have historically in education systems, where this is a traditional divide between policy and learning. So that's why we're here, is to help address this divide, to help us redesign schools for the 21st century. Thank you.
So we actually had 2 extremely intensive days of arguing and working and debating. And one thing we all agree is that, as Dr. Maroba has clearly said, we now know much more about learning, but how much of what we know about how learning takes place hasn't quite made enough impact on learning in practice. And particularly we are concerned about learning inside in education, in schools and other institutions. So we were talking about, okay, so what can we do? And we came up with basically 5 points. And I'm going to briefly describe the 5 points that we come up with. For one thing, we find that it's important that we design effective, inclusive learning environments. So the most important thing for us to do in education is not to teach, and not to even design activities or resources, but to design learning environments. What do we mean by learning environments? Obviously, physical environments are important. If we say that learning has to be collaborative, if learning can be taking place through play, if learning is going to take place through through experience, or through creative work, then is the classroom, is the physical space that we are in appropriate? And it's not just the physical space. What about the digital space? And what about the social space? and also the cultural space. So all these are part of the environment for learning. And we need to be looking at it not as sort of one-size-fits-all environment, because learners are not all the same. Another point we come up with is that the need to align pedagogy and assessment. Many of us do agree that the way that learning happens is actually very important. It's not just what people learn, especially in relation to keep building the capacity to learn, or the capacity to do things, to innovate, to problem solve. But then what about the assessment that we have? And there is a big gap between what we are assessing and what we believe what learning should be like. And we believe that assessment should be primarily authentic tasks that actually allow people to understand what the learner can do, and also how the learner can improve. The assessment should be much more embedded within the learning process, and there should be continuous feedback for the learning process as well. The third point we came up with is that we need to enhance the capabilities to optimize the use of technologies in the service of learning, which is to support learner autonomy and to strengthen learning capacity. And when we talk about the technologies in the service of learning, we are not only talking about technology which are specifically designed for learning, but also those which are actually tools that we use. Say, for example, Google Maps, for example, Wikis, Facebook, or whatever. These are not particularly tools that were designed for learners, but they are very important for learners as well. The fourth point we agree on is that we should promote professional learning communities, networks, and brokerage. Now, what does that mean? Now, first of all, say the curriculum, the pedagogy, and the assessment are going to be so different, it is not that the learner has to be learning very differently. Every one of us, students, parents, teachers, policymakers, principals, they all need to be working differently. And how do we know how to work differently? So we need to build professional learning communities, and there needs to be vertical networking across the different levels of stakeholders, and also networking across them. And then I think the last and the most important point is that we need to foster learning leadership at different levels, at the micro, meso, and macro. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, if we were to be changing, there needs to be leadership. And what does leadership mean? We mean vision, strategy, and resources. So at different levels, at the international, national, school, and individual level, all these needs to be aligned. For example, personal space for learning. And the personal space is not only time, but also the ability to make mistakes and so on. So this is just a taster of what we have come up with. And I'm sure that you will want to take this opportunity to ask our panel experts what this means.
So in the following, we will allow the members to express their views, echo some of their views about these 5 points. We have no plan, we have no orchestration, it's up to them. Yes.
Mic on? Mic on now? Yes, mic on now. I'm from the OECD, which is an intergovernmental organization, but I'm also in the Center for Research and Innovation. So, therefore, bridging the worlds of government, policy, research, and innovation. And in those different domains, with those different stakeholders, the learning agenda is clearly really bubbling up and coming to the fore. So the topic of your conference, the topic of our discussions over the last 2 days, it seems to me, are really now coming right into focus. But what's kind of interesting to observe is that a lot of the policies, a lot of the ways that we try and influence change in schooling, for example, are about measuring quality, about addressing structures and funding. They're about thinking about teacher preparation, school choice. But often we treat what goes on inside classrooms and in other places of learning, what goes on in terms of teaching and learning, as a kind of black box in the policy world. Now, why might that be? Why is it a kind of rather dim black box? I think there are perhaps two reasons to underline. One, with so many millions of schools, of learners, of teachers, of communities, of settings, it's a very complex business to actually try and penetrate that black box. As somebody said yesterday, this isn't rocket science, it's much harder than that. So it's really complex. And the second reason, I think, is that we're collectively rather reluctant to step into the domain of the individual teacher. There's been a sort of a tradition that that's a world that is the teacher's world. And therefore, to start to look inside that black box is in some sense perhaps to curb teacher autonomy and teacher professionalism. Now what we're saying is we don't think that this can go on, that it should not go on. We do have increasingly the knowledge to go inside that black box to address the complexity. And we feel that it isn't about diminishing teacher professionalism. On the contrary, it is really about enhancing it. Teachers with the other key players in shaping learning environments, this is a key way of actually enhancing teacher professionalism. So the 5 points that Nancy Law has just outlined to you are a kind of starting point, really, for how we see a way ahead. We feel it is very important to clarify and foster learning leadership, providing vision, adapting to challenges and adapting to the learning that's going on in our different learning environments. So not just institutional management, but learning leadership. We feel that we must focus now on design of and building learning environments together, not just single classrooms, but coherent, high quality teams working together and informed by research findings. We feel that we need to create ways for all the professionals to work together in networks, in different professional communities, with different stakeholders and experts. In other words, we don't leave it to the individual teacher, we don't leave it to the individual school. We must synergize, we must go to scale. We need to have new curricula. This point has been made well, I think, by my colleagues. We need new curricula for the 21st century, but if that's going to be achieved, we will need appropriate pedagogies and appropriate forms of assessment. Otherwise, they will not be achieved. And finally, we should really get the most from technology, not just as another way of doing the same things that we've always been doing, but to actually really get new forms of learning and to really stimulate the learners in our different schools and learning environments. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity of being here, to the organizers and to you. I come from the Latin American region, and I lead an hemispheric organization. It's a network which gathers organizations and individuals who are interested in contributing to improve the quality, equity, and efficiency of our public school systems. 20 or more years investing in educational reform in this region have taught us that we need to move from a paradigm that emphasizes changes, institutional changes, to another one that emphasizes, rather than institutional changes, changes in the ways of improving the provision of learning services to all children in our countries. It obliges us to build systems that make schools accountable. We don't have that yet. To invest in the teacher profession, to invest in teacher training, to attract better teachers to the profession, and to improve their working conditions. Their working conditions are not good in the region. Also, we must involve parents and local communities in the learning processes and strengthen the involvement of decision makers, school managers, teachers in general, parents, and other relevant actors in society. The reasons for this are rather simple, but rather terrible. It has to do with the way in which Latin American schools compare with other schools in other regions in the world. Let me give you some flash information. Latin America invests a lot in education. In the past decades, it has, in some cases, like Chile, for example, duplicated the resources for educational reform. Quintuplicated the resources for educational reform. Most of the countries spend more than the global average. Brazil, for example, one of the biggest countries in the region, spends more than most Latin American countries. Concerning coverage, we are in a relatively good position. Enrollments are going up, but gaps still exist. We still have low enrollments in secondary and university levels, and we must rapidly overcome this situation. The worst problem, quality is low when measured by the results we obtain in the international testing systems. If you know the results of Latin American countries, we are the lowest, occupying the lowest places in international ranking, and Latin American countries really rank at the lowest places in this scale. Brazil, again, which invests more than other countries, has a high number of low performers and no top performers, and that is really serious. Thus, education in our region is failing to build human capital, particularly for the poor segments of society. Poor students in our countries are more than 2 grade levels below that their rich peers in reading. The same happens in mathematics. The same happens in science. Concerning spending, yes, spending has increased in our countries. Most countries invest more than the 4% that is required of the product, but none of them have reached the 7% that is required to obtain good quality in education. And spending does not benefit the poor segments of society. Latin America lags behind in science and technology. Scientific productivity, according to available evidence, is below other developing countries. The number of patents in Latin America is very low. Thus, this has obliged our governments and our civil society organizations and society as a whole to look and to build consensus in order to enter second generation reforms that will enable us to raise secondary and tertiary enrollments, to build quality education, and that is why putting learning as a priority in the political agenda is very important, increase equity, and grow in science and technology.
Okay, thank you. I would like to add a bit to the discussion from a European point of view, in particular from a research point of view, addressing challenges at the European level, European policies on education and training, and see how research can address and help to develop these policies on education and training. And in more particular, I would like to speak about the link between ICT and education. Information and communication technologies and education. Why? Because as David said, there's a strong potential, we all know that, for the use of ICT for learning. If we look at our world, the digital society we are living in, if we look at students, they are using and embracing technologies, Facebook, Wikipedia, mobile, tweets, etc. I mean, all these technologies are available outside of the educational setting, you could say, outside of the classroom. And then if we look at within the classroom, we see that actually they are hardly used, they are underused, or they are maybe badly used. So we still have a big problem there to realize, also at the European level, to realize much more progress in the use of ICT for education and training and for learning more broadly. One of the reasons why we need much more progress is, and it has been said by David, I think, is that, I mean, realizing educational change is indeed a very complicated process. It's a very complicated process because in the end it needs holistic change. And that was one of the problems when we had the area of e-learning, you could say, and we were trying just to digitize analog processes in education and training, and we actually saw that it's not working. Because we really need new ways of doing things. And actually we need new pedagogies. We need pedagogies that really embrace working with technologies for learning purposes. And there I think research has a strong role to play, but also policies have a strong role to play. And that's actually also to link it to practice. Because that we were actually discussing also here in the policy forum today and yesterday, is that if we want to advance our area, that we need to much strongly link research with policy, with practice. That might be a way to get to a much stronger mainstreaming of ICT in education and training. Where I see personally, and in my research, the strongest potential of ICT, that is of course to make learning more inclusive, more relevant, more fun also, more effective. But I see three key issues or three key areas emerging where ICT plays a key role for learning. The first one is personalization, to make the learning experience much more personalized, because obviously, as we all know, every learner is different, and we have to take that diversity much stronger into account, and I think ICT technologies play a role. The second is to make learning much more collaborative, and that of course I do not have to argue, because this is the theme of the conference, Computer Supported Collaborative Learning. And the third is to embrace much more informal learning, because we see actually also that people use technologies a lot to learn from each other in online networks, not with the purpose of learning, but just to share experiences. And we have to try to embrace and take that informal learning realm also much more into account into our formal learning environments. But what we need, as said, and I will finish with that, we need strong policies, we need strong research, and we need to connect it actually to educational practice and pedagogies. Thank you.
Yes, we're now open to the floor, and then our other members will also respond. I wonder if you still remember the 5 points that Nancy mentioned. Learning environment. Learning literature is the last one, right? What? According to your order. Okay, you repeat.
Okay, that's a reminder of the 5 points then. Learning leadership, learning environment, professional learning communities, networks and brokerage, aligning pedagogy and assessment, and then use of technologies in the service of learning.
Any comments, suggestions, queries, protests? This captures only a very, very tiny part of what we discussed, but I'm quite sure you have other views to express and other questions to ask, and we'll try to see how we think. Yes, Keith, our Dean of Education.
Yeah, could I raise a question as a teacher, educator and Dean of the Faculty of Education? And the emphasis on back to learning is very, very welcome and timely, and I just wonder where it leaves us as teacher educators. I mean, what do you see as the sort of teacher that we should be preparing to address the agenda that you've set out in your five points?
Marcia, and then Diana.
Is this on?
It is on. It is on.
It's on? Can you hear me? Oh, good. I'm Marcia Lynn from the University of California at Berkeley. Thank you for that very intriguing question about how we can, parlay the recommendations that we came up with really to improve teacher education and teacher preparation. I think one of the things that really characterized our discussions was an attempt to move from sort of comparing countries to a global perspective on education, to thinking about how really we share many, many problems, and if we really compare the solutions that we've come up with and try to learn from each other's efforts, we will be more effective overall as a community than if we work individually and actually often, I think, at least in the United States, repeat the errors that others have made. So we tried to think about how we could advance that opportunity. And certainly one area that we spoke about was sort of the combination between curriculum and teacher preparation. And sort of how, if we are advocating for these more innovative, inquiry-oriented pedagogies, well, what do teachers need in order to succeed in that endeavor? And the thing that we talked about, I think, the most was how to infuse contemporary issues and controversies and concerns into the curriculum, things that teachers and students care about and that really are important issues that everybody needs to understand in order to be prepared for the 21st century. Because I think teachers feel obligated to do something about 21st century skills, but not really clear on the way to go about that. And I think that we have, in many of our countries, thought about these issues, but putting our heads together and combining our efforts would indeed advance this agenda. One of the things that we talked about was sort of promoting discussion of these contemporary controversies, not only within our own countries, but across cultural boundaries, and trying to build curriculum materials that could be readily customized in new countries. And then we could look at the effects of those kinds of customizations from a research perspective, but also from a policy perspective. We talked a great deal about, what that means from the standpoint specifically of teacher preparation, and I think Diana really has some insights into that from the British perspective.
Diana, please. Please, yes, please.
Was that functioning? Good. Okay, sorry. Yes, I mean, following on from that, the learner and learning was a particular focus for us to begin with, but we very quickly got on to discussing the teacher and teaching. And for the following reason. What we find ourselves doing all the time is putting a tremendous challenging task onto teachers who have to do what they do every day, plus they have to cope with a new kind of curriculum, they have to cope with new kinds of pedagogies, they have to cope with new kinds of technologies. I just want to give you a flavor of how we might think about the nature of that challenging task by asking you to do a thought experiment. And the thought experiment begins with a hypothetical counterfactual, which is a kind of tricky thing to do late on a hot day, but let's see if we can go there. Imagine that our planet was the kind of planet where we'd managed to develop virtual technologies before we developed physical technologies. And we had very good connectivity and virtual presence, but we all still lived in kind of caves. Okay. Difficult, I know, but stay with me. You have to suspend disbelief for a minute. And somewhere around the middle of the 20th century, we discovered the technology of building, and we were able to make buildings and build roads and write books and create paper and so on. And the governments, mindful of the importance of keeping up with new technologies, wanted education to change and take advantage of this. And so they built schools and universities, and they created libraries and published books and so on. They said to the teaching profession, okay, here you are. Now you can go and teach these new pedagogies in this wonderful new environment. And the teachers all said, but we know how to teach online. We don't know how to teach in a place. How do we do this? And the government says, well, it's all right. We're organizing for you a one-day workshop where you can find out exactly how to do all this. Now, it's kind of ridiculous, but there has to be some way of engaging us in a powerful understanding of just how hard a task we're putting onto teachers. So that's why teachers were an important part of our discussions. And we talked so much about enabling the teaching profession to talk among themselves, to collaborate, to discover what the new pedagogies are, to share those ideas, to build on each other's ideas, to interact much more closely with the research which is going on, and also to interact much more closely with the policymakers. So those kinds of dialogues, those collaborations, that working together is a very important part of the things that we've been discussing and we want to try and promote.
Yes, Naomi?
Let me just build on what Dan has been talked about here on how we can go for teacher training. We have been trying to change our perspective from teacher-centric teaching to student or the learner-centric teaching or education. And we probably have to start thinking about not researchers or policymakers or whoever will be coming on the top to try to teach how to teach for teacher education, but has to give some agency as teaching and learning agent for the teachers. That's why the networking of those teachers becomes so important, and thinking about and giving them as to helping them to become an independent designers of teaching situations and creators of those communities so that they can learn from each other and also try to help their target of students to be an independent learner.